Yeah, messieurs! Welcome back to the Spearfishing channel. In this week's video, I'll be covering a couple of dives I did up north, and on this first day, something happened that can only be described as crazy. Me and a couple of my partners headed out for an afternoon dive, and we made our first stop behind point. This was not my first drop of the day, so since I was warmed up already, I was hitting the outer edge of the reef at around 60 feet. The visibility in this spot was much better than normal, meaning I could see fish that were much further away. They were really hard to see on the camera, but there were some really nice snappers and porgies in the distance, so I made sure to lie on the bottom as long as possible to try and get one of those fish to come into range. This nice grey snapper was one of the main fish I was targeting here, and now that I knew they were in the area, I decided to move down the reef to try and find some more. Before I was even on the bottom, I could tell this spot had a lot more life than on my previous drop. There were all kinds of small pot fish around, but none of them were big enough to shoot, and I was more just hoping for another snapper. After a while, this big school of mahogany snappers started coming closer, and mixed in with them was another nice grey snapper. This fish was slightly bigger than the last one I got, and it weighed in at around the 2-pound mark. I honestly would have been happy shooting these fish all day, but it was starting to get late and we decided to look for some bigger fish. We ended up at Pebble Beach, and on my first drop here, something unbelievable happened. That was a big Jack Crevalle, and even though I put in a really good shot, it still managed to escape. At first, I thought it had just burst my line, but when I went down to collect my spare, I realized it was in 2 pieces. Somehow, the fish was able to break it at one of the loading notches, meaning my day of diving was over. However, I did have an extra spare line around at home, so I went back out the next day to make up for that broken spare. On day 2, I went out with Make It Happen, and my goal was to get a big mutton snapper. We stopped outside a VG, and while I was making blind drops to try and find some structure, I saw something moving near the bottom. This fish came in at 3 pounds, so it wasn't the size I was looking for, but at least I had gotten the species I was targeting. Also, since that mutton was one of the first fish of the day, we had some really high hopes for this area. However, it turned out to be the only one that was in this zone. We decided to change spots, and as soon as we got there, I took this beautiful permit off camera, and from that point on, I was ready for anything. This spot is an area where I've seen huge muttons in the past, so on this drop I made sure to land right next to the area where the reef meets the sand. These areas are my go-to zones when I'm hunting a reef I don't know very well, and I always make sure to spend as much time on the bottom as possible. With those big muttons in mind, I was trying to be super selective with my shots, but then I saw the biggest mahogany snapper of my life. Even though it wasn't very big, that fish still managed to get me tangled in the reef, so I dropped my gun to retrieve it on my next dive. Mahogany snappers are some of the smallest snapper species we get in St. Lucia, and with this 2-pounder being my biggest one ever, it really gave me hope that those big muttons were not far behind. However, before I could even make another drop, a nice Cero Mackerel swam right underneath me. As soon as I got that fish into my hands, I dispatched it to preserve the eating qualities and so I could get back to hunting as quick as possible. Just like my drop before, I went straight to the bottom near the reef sand line and I started to wait for something to swim by. A few months before this, I saw a giant mutton in this exact spot, so I was really hoping that this would be the dive that I got one. Since I wasn't seeing anything big, the potfish around me were getting really tempting, but luckily I decided to save my shot. When I turned to my right, I saw this school of big mutton snappers cruising by the sand, and I just waited for one to give me a shot. I knew this was a nice fish when I shot it, but now that I had that fish in my hands, I realized it was a proper mutton snapper. It ended up weighing in at 9 pounds, which made it a really solid mutton, and it was one of the coolest experiences that I've ever had hunting them. In my life, I've shot countless of these fish, but it was the first and only time I had seen so many big ones moving together like that. After doing some research and from what I've seen on YouTube, I believe that was my first experience with a mutton spawn, and it was quite the spectacle. Those fish also came at the perfect time because right after that, the boat came over for us to go back home.